Today's episode is going to be the first in a short series that I'm doing on the spiritual sciences or the sacred sciences, meaning what is the methodology, what are some of the principles behind the methods of spiritual tradition, of spiritual discipline and practice. There's quite a bit of places where spirituality does not agree with itself because there's so many different traditions and approaches to it. Yet despite that, the essential principles that many of these disciplines utilize are the same across their cultural backgrounds, across their ethnic backgrounds, and the religious constructs. The essential principles remain the same. So in today's episode, we're going to be doing the first video on this, which is looking at what are some of these first principles that form the basis of spirituality throughout the world, and trying to look at a unified view of the spiritual traditions as much as we can. And then in subsequent videos, we'll go deeper into some of the particular approaches and methods of the path. So I hope you enjoy. The first thing that I want us to look at is this issue of art versus science. Spirituality is, just like science, meant to be very impersonal and based on impersonal principles, but tends to become very personal along the way. Just like most scientists end up having a very personal connection to their particular field of science, especially if they hope to have any kind of excellency or achievement within that field. Likewise, within the spiritual tradition, even though some of the principles we're working with are very impersonal, we have to approach it at first, at least, in a very personal way, in a way that we can relate to, in a way that has some value and meaning to us personally, and in a way that makes spirituality at all relevant to our daily lives, to our jobs, our families, our day-to-day routines, so we can slowly take advantage of it. We can slowly integrate it into the rest of our lives. Because it has such a personal aspect to it, in a way, there is some art to it. Right? It's not just pure science. It's not pure method. So for the sake of the episode, when I'm talking about something being scientific, I mean it has a really impersonal first principles and deducing from first principles without any regard for the personal observer, as much as possible to arrive at certain conclusions using the scientific method. Though the scientific method, to an extent, plays a role in any kind of tried and true method. So it also, because it's part of just how you test a method, it's not really something that only exists in science. It's a logical process of trying to prove something and experience something, of trying to arrive at certain conclusions, and especially trying to make sure that the premises you're working with are true. So in the spiritual path, we do this as well. Right? We have certain premises that we're building our path on, that we're building our faith on. We have certain methods that we're using to try to test these premises, and gradually over time we arrive at certain conclusions as a result of our constant experimentation. And this experiment happens at a psychological level, an emotional level, physical level, spiritual level. There's many different dimensions to spiritual and personal cultivation that go beyond the realm of trying to learn about things in the material world. And this is one of the reasons why there can be a difficulty having consensus on different aspects of the spiritual path. And even in science, and by science I mean like materialistic or hard sciences, even in modern science, the bigger the problem becomes, the more difficult it is to tackle, the less of a consensus there is. People, for whatever reason, when they start talking about science, and they say, well, science believes this, or science says that, science says this. I don't know what kind of science they're talking about. You have to be more specific, because do you mean neuroscience says this? Do you mean cognitive science says this? Do you mean astronomy says this? Do you mean quantum physics says this? And then if you do, where is this council of scientific elders somewhere that are stamping their seal of approval upon what you're saying science believes? Because the fact of the matter is, within any scientific field, there's a great deal of disagreement. There aren't a lot of across the field consensus on some of these major scientific issues, such as the creation of the universe, what is consciousness, those kinds of problems. Even something that should be relatively straightforward and simple, such as why is the Earth changing? Is global warming there? What effect do people have on climate change? And there can be radical disagreements amongst particular groups in the scientific community, even on something that seems fairly straightforward and simple when we look at it logically. So as a result of this, I think people sometimes have a misconstrued view. Science does not exist in a total consensus. Likewise, spirituality does not exist in a total consensus because we're dealing with universal principles. We're dealing with things such as consciousness, time, space, form, sound, energy. And really, science deals with those things too. The biggest difference between how modern science approaches these issues, these first principles of the universe, and how someone like a yogi or tantrika or meditator might approach them, is that science is generally going to operate from a bottom up view with first principles, where consciousness is something that's created as a result of material circumstances. And then with that consciousness, we work upwards to try to learn more about other first principles like time and space and being. Whereas from the perspective of spiritual cultivation, we have a top-down relationship to consciousness. So consciousness becomes one of the first principles, if not the first principle itself, the primary principle. And then we work forward to try to experiment and understand how it is consciousness takes shape, how it is that consciousness can experience space and time, form, energy, matter, all these different aspects. And so from spiritual tradition, we're primarily conscious entities. We're primarily conscious agents, as opposed to being primarily physical agents. So even though our views are 180 degrees from each other, we're looking at the same problems, right? The spiritual traditions and modern science are really looking at the same, to an extent, the same problems of creation, of life, of existence. But our views are from opposite sides of the issue. The hope is that the spiritual traditions can actually learn a little bit from some of the scientific communities, because it's not the consensus of the scientific community that makes it so powerful. What makes science amazing is that it grows when there's a lack of consensus. So science is always moving forward. It's never stale, it's never stagnant. It's the disagreement within science that actually promulgates it, that actually makes it grow, makes it develop, and try to reach higher and higher degrees of excellency, of development. And whereas in spiritual traditions, a lot of times, due to rigidity of mind, due to extreme orthodoxy and rigidity of mind, the spiritual path becomes very stagnant at times. Different spiritual traditions go through periods where they don't really develop for sometimes even centuries at a time. Sometimes they never develop again. Nothing new is brought in. Nothing fresh is added to it. In some traditions, anything new is actually, treated very hostilely, and, that's different than what we believe. That's different than what we think to be true. And the antagonism that spiritual traditions have towards each other is a real big issue, because it actually keeps them from growing. So in the scientific community, even though you can also have that kind of intense rigidity and inflexibility of mind, which can make certain scientific views become very problematic, become outdated. There could be problems with, a professor who spent their whole life proving a certain view, and then someone else comes around and disproves it. And now, what are you going to do? Are you going to throw your whole life's work out the door? Well, a good scientist will, but a lot of scientists don't. There's certainly a lot of orthodoxy, a lot of dogma in modern science. But nonetheless, there is ultimately a culture of disagreement that allows for growth and personal cultivation. The spiritual traditions don't really have a culture of disagreement like that, which is something that they suffer from, and something that hopefully, as time goes on, gets fixed. As more of these traditions interact with each other, this is really only the first 100 years right now of all of these spiritual traditions being exposed to each other. Most spiritual traditions developed on islands, their own little religious and cultural and ethical islands. And as a result of that, they didn't really blend particularly well with some of these other traditions once they met. Now, enough time has passed, people more and more often are starting to see that there are a lot of similarities between these traditions. And what's astonishing to me isn't the places where these traditions disagree with each other. It's how, despite being separated sometimes by immense geography, by cultural issues, social separations, religious separations, despite all the different ways these spiritual practices and views were separated, there are sometimes astonishing similarities in them. And that to me is far more interesting than the disagreements between the different traditions, is the actual unity that some of them have. I don't really care much for the fact that they disagree with each other at times, because they grew up in completely different social and religious situations. But what's astonishing to me is how often the first principles of the spiritual path remain the same, regardless which part of the world they arise in, regardless which religion they're a part of, regardless which social and ethnic groups they end up arising from. The basic principles remain the same, which is really astonishing, because I think that in and of itself is worth a lot of consideration. That human consciousness, when it tries to tackle some of these issues on its own, using really just its consciousness, when it tries to tackle some of the issues of life and meaning and purpose, tends to arrive at a lot of the same conclusions, regardless of time and place. All of this to say that, yes, well, there is a lot of art, a lot of, by art, I mean, a very personal approach to spirituality, because we're dealing with our own salvation or unification, our own realization, and ultimately, hopefully, helping others as well. It begins very personally. And that's something that separates it a little bit from science, which begins very impersonally. But despite that, there are actually first principles at the basis of all of these things, and I'm going to try to do my best here to help walk you through a few of them so that we can understand them. All of spirituality treats the person, the individual, as primarily being a conscious entity that is wrapped up in non-conscious elements. Right? Something, in other words, that there's a conscious agent at the basis of our existence, which, if we look at ourselves, that's what we experience ourselves to be. We live very psychological lives. Psychological happiness is more important to us than just transitory physical pleasures. The things that we want in life are psychological ideals. They're intellectual ideals, such as success and meaning and purpose and drive, none of which can be pointed to on a scale, none of which can be measured and weighed out. And so we, to an extent, at least experience ourselves as conscious entities. We can say our main concern with life is a conscious one. Science, when we talk about material science, takes our personal entity to be largely physical, and consciousness is part of our physical experience of life. That is really the opposite, 180 degrees away from the spiritual approach. From all the religious and spiritual traditions in the world, we work from the other view of consciousness. Consciousness is not a result of first principles interacting with each other. Consciousness is itself one of those first principles. It is either equal to things like time and space and form, or it's prior to them. Most traditions say that it's prior, and that it is precisely because it is prior that us, with our consciousness, we are able to investigate all those other elements of reality. We're able to cognize them because in some way, shape, or form, consciousness envelops them, consciousness embraces them. So this is one of our first principles that we work with, is from consciousness. So having admitted, or having decided to choose this as a premise for your spiritual work, next arises this issue of how then does consciousness relate with time, with space, with phenomena inside time and space, such as form, appearance, energy, activity. How do all these things arise? And what has been more or less universally concluded by many of the spiritual traditions, the Taoist traditions, the Hindu yogic traditions, and Vedantic traditions, Tibetan tantric methods, the Northern Himalayan methods, even aspects of Western spirituality such as Platonism, mystic Christianity, Sufism, Kabbalah, just about every mystical tradition you can think of, has arrived at a set of basic understandings that consciousness has a definite relationship to time, to space, to form, to energy, and which we experience in our own life because we participate in these things. We're experiencing time, we're experiencing space, we're experiencing movement and activity and thought and feeling. So consciousness is experiencing these things. And from the spiritual perspective, all these experiences are not equal. From the highest perspective, they are. We say ultimately from pure consciousness, they're all just something other than consciousness. Or maybe even, according to some traditions, like in Advaitic traditions, they're all the same as pure consciousness. The issue is when we work with it personally, when we start out with just where we are right now, if we look at our lives, we see that we ourselves are operating according to time and space and form, conditions, activities, all these kinds of things. And if we're operating at that level, that's the level we need to kind of begin with. That's where we need to start. And so the spiritual traditions hold that From the perspective of the pursuit of consciousness, from the perspective of the pursuit of pure reality, consciousness experiences time and in some ways inhabits time, but not all time is the same for consciousness, or at least consciousness does not experience all times exactly the same. We can say at least you do not experience all times to be identical with each other. You don't experience all form to be identical. You don't experience all activities to be the same and identical. This is obvious when we look at our lives, right? There are times that we feel are better for sleep, and times that are better for waking, times that are better for eating, times that are better for fasting, times that are better for certain activities or religious works or social works, right? Family things, family events where we meet on certain days and at certain times. And we don't want those times to become just muddied and confused with each other, right? We don't necessarily want that. We like the order, the harmony of it, going to work at a certain time, finishing work at a certain time, having time for family, but not all of our time being embraced by family. We manage time so we can experience time in a way that we feel is conducive to our overall well-being. Likewise, not all shapes are the same to us, right? There are forms and appearances that we find we find a strong aversion towards. There are forms that we prefer and find more pleasurable. There are people we prefer in our lives, people we prefer not to be in our lives. There are actions that we feel are much better, more noble actions, and there are actions that we feel are very violent and negative and that we don't want to be a part of our life. So at least within ourselves, consciousness has this living relationship with these basic elements of reality around us, with these basic elements of time, space, form, and activity especially. So just like how in our normal mundane life, we have this relationship with all these elements of reality, and we have certain preferences, and we don't ourselves treat all these elements as though they're the same. Likewise, within the spiritual tradition, what's happened is a kind of categorization of times and places and activities, where not all times are treated the same. Sometimes, some periods of time are seen as being particularly more sensitive or more making your own brain or your own mind more impressionable to reality as it is. There are certain times of the day where your body is more impressionable to thoughts and energies. There are certain times of the day where your body is more impressionable to experiencing reality as it is. There are certain places where it seems that something about that place, that sacred place, is special. There's something there where when people are there, they have spiritual experiences, religious experiences, they open up to reality more. There are certain activities that seem to be more or less conducive to our experience of the truth, that the more we engage in activities of, if we use like the Indian, the Sanskrit word sattvic activity, very pure activity, eating pure foods, engaging in pure speech, truthful speech, noble speech and deeds, acting virtuously, living virtuously and self-controlled, gradually somehow there's less impediments to our experience of reality. We can still experience reality full of impediments, but what the traditions establish is that that's kind of a difficult thing to do. There aren't a lot of people that can just leap over the entirety of creation and try to experience pure consciousness. Instead, because we ourselves are still relating to everything in this relative way, we can use relativity as a friend instead of an enemy. And this is really the basis of spiritual discipline, is that we can take Maya, we can take illusion, we can take the world of appearances, of time and space and form and meaning, and instead of making it our enemy, instead of making it something we're afraid of, instead of making it something we're trying to ignore or tell ourselves, hypnotize ourselves into believing it's not there, we can make it a friend. We can make it something that actually we can take full advantage of our own embodiment. We can take full advantage of the fact that we're an entity in time and space. And the way we can do that is to learn to use time and space and activity and energy. We can learn to use these things. We can use them to our advantage for consciousness to fully experience itself. Consciousness can encounter different aspects of itself. There are times that are more sacred, so to say. By sacred, I mean that there are times in the day, in the year, and in cycles of years, and seasons, and lunar cycles. There are times where we become more receptive, we become more sensitive to energy, to nature, to reality. There are times where our psyche is more impressionable. And if we engage in spiritual disciplines at those times, we can transform our psyche with much more ease than if we try to do it at times that are somewhat averse, where the mind becomes much more rigid at those times. Likewise, there are places and certain spatial conditions that if we can practice in those places or visit them at times, something about that place, maybe it's magnetic, maybe it's that level of consciousness, maybe there's something that we don't understand happening there. There are places, we can even within our own home make a sacred space that itself becomes more conducive to our pursuit of the truth. There are certain activities that if we engage in, and other activities that if we decide not to engage in anymore, will gradually help transform ourselves, that render us more and more sensitive, more and more pure really isn't a good word. I think sensitive is actually a better translation, a better approach to the word sattvic, which is normally translated as pure or light or expansive, open. Really, that's what we're trying to do. You're trying to create a condition where psychologically, spiritually, you're more open, you're more sensitive to experiencing the truth as it is, beyond all your conditioning, beyond all of the mental input that you constantly give yourself. Likewise, there are different forms that are more impressed by life energy, by spiritual impulses. We can look at nature and see that nature favors certain forms over others. We see a lot of cylindrical things in nature, such as in cells and trees and bones. We see a lot of circular, oval type appearances in nature. Nature has certain forms that it prefers, very certain kind of spherical realities that it prefers. And likewise, in our own practices, there are certain gestures, certain positions, meditative positions, ways that we sit, visual appearances such as yantras, sacred forms and diagrams and talismanic images that are seen to be much more impressed, so to say, by consciousness, or in some way operate a little bit, make us more sensitive to experiencing pure consciousness, to experiencing reality the way that it is. So when we talk about things like spiritual sciences, what we mean is that there are really many of the spiritual methods, if not all of them, involve working with these first principles, with these approaches of how does consciousness experience time? How does consciousness experience space? How does it experience form and movement, activity, energy, life? And as much as possible, trying to use these elements to expand our consciousness, to experience our consciousness more directly, and to take advantage of these elements of existence so that we can fully achieve our potential. We can realize our own personal and spiritual potential. Many spiritual practices will actually employ all of these. They'll tell you, choose a part in the home that is separated just for your spiritual disciplines and arrange it in a certain way. So this accompanies and accounts for the spatial aspect. They'll say, meditate at these times of the day, in the morning or in the evening while the sun's rising, while it's setting, or in, early in the morning, 2 hours before sunrise. And they'll tell you what times of the day to avoid. And that accounts for the spatial aspect. They'll tell you what the minimum amount of practice is. That also accounts for not the spatial, for the temporal aspect, for the time aspect of it. There'll be certain visualizations, which will account for the form. There'll be certain posture you have to sit in, which is also the form. There'll be certain breathing methods that you have to apply, and visualizations and activities you engage in during the practice, which count for the energy and the movement, the life aspect of it. And so good spiritual traditions, or I can at least say more complete, more holistic spiritual traditions, take into account as many of these elements as they can, so that every single time you practice, you're getting the most out of your practice, which is very important for people like householders, people who have jobs, who have lives, who can't go live in a cave or in a monastery for the rest of their life. They need to get the absolute most out of every single minute of their practice. And it's really, to my view, it's really for them. It's for householders, for family people, for people who are working, that much of the spiritual path exists. If you separate yourself from everything and try to dwell in pure consciousness, eventually you realize the truth. But it's very difficult to do that when you have a baby crying who needs some food and you have bills that need to be paid. Instead, you have to start experiencing the sacred in little pieces and parts throughout your day. And that's really what the spiritual path is all about, is learning how to get the absolute most, how to get hours of spiritual development out of 20 or 30 minutes of practice a day. So this is, I think, serves as a good beginning ground, kind of a beginning theory or beginning view to work on for our subsequent videos, where we're going to dive more deeply into things such as time, for example, looking at, well, what are some of the lunar phases, the solar phases, the seasonal aspects of time, the daily aspects of time. How do we get the most out of these things? What's the kind of consensus of the tradition about these things? We'll do a video looking at some of the spatial aspects too, and sound and activities such as mantra, tantra, yantra, and understanding how some of these things relate to our path as well and how we can implement it. The goal of these few episodes here is to be as universal as possible, which is very difficult to do since generally these things take very particular forms according to whichever traditions and religions they arose from. As much as possible throughout these episodes, going to be trying to look at it in as general a way as possible so that any practitioner from any tradition can increase their understanding and benefit their practice from it. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to making the subsequent ones. Thank you.